familiar with it, that are barely familiar with their own cycle, and that helps. That we're going to try to gravitate toward that a little bit, at least in the beginning, to help you with this. Now, I want everybody to do this though before we get started. I want you to. I've doctored one of the slides, and you'll see it when we get to it. I want you to take a piece of paper, maybe even this slide, which is, it says it's slide 272, but in yours it may not be. I got 3 little diagrams at the bottom of this slide. Let me enlarge it. I want you to, on this slide or on a separate piece of paper, to draw 3 circles. Draw 3 circles that look like this. And then we'll refer to them from time to time. The first question I was asked is, which one is your type? Which circle applies to you? And most of you would figure out that this one that's underneath this human. You are we're talking about diploidy, the ploidy concept, diploid versus haploid. And you have to visualize these 3 circles as going clockwise. All 3 of them are moving in a clockwise direction. And I want you to put an S right here at this line, S. And S will stand for syngamy, or that's gametic union. Actually, let's deal with yours first. This is you. All right. At this point, the sperm and egg unite, and that's called syngamy. And there's a zygote divides by mitosis, and here you are. Okay. At maturity or sexual age, you under your cells in your gonads, the testes and the ovaries, undergo meiosis. And at that point, you have gametes. So you're going to write an M here. So S here, S for what? Not S-I-N-gamy, but S-Y-N-gamy, syngamy. And then over here, the M stands for what? Not meiosis, but M-E-I-O-S-I-S, meiosis. We're going to talk about that toward the end today. Meiosis is, syngamy is just wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, so to speak. But meiosis is is a big deal. It's hard to comprehend. Gametic fusion is not hard to comprehend, but the meiosis is. All right, now for this alternation of generations, which is typical of this area in the middle here, that's where N comes together with another N, that's syngamy, and over here is meiosis. And what undergoes meiosis we're going to talk about is not a zygote, but a spore mother cell. All right, so if you got those circles and label them, you'll be ahead of the game. Let's go back and start this process. All right, now let me get this blown up. All right, now those circles give you an idea of this circle is obviously the alternation generations life cycle, the one that typical of higher plants, the higher plants, the ones you're familiar with. Everything revolves around these 2 processes, meiosis and fertilization. Better yet, the more generic term is S-Y-N-G-A-M-Y, syngamy. Now, let's see. Before we get into the heavy-duty sexual reproduction, let's talk about the easier process, asexual reproduction. And I label it a short-term asset and a long-term liability. Now, plants, like strawberry plants, can do both sexual reproduction by flowers and produce the fruit, strawberries, and asexual reproduction at the same time. No animal can do that. Okay. In fact, Animals can't even regenerate asexually, except for with a few exceptions, like starfish and some others. And we're now doing some limb regeneration, but it's just cloning asexually animals is something that's not easily done, if it can be done at all, in the lab. But now, I said that, well, I actually pointed out there's a short-term asset and a long-term liability. Think of it this way. In 1846, and I'm talking about asexual reproduction, in Ireland, what happened? The great potato blight happened. Phytophthora infestans, a late blight of potato, infected the Irish potato population or white potato population in Ireland. And the problem was everybody was playing with a genetic basket that's the same. When you propagate potatoes, what do? You cut the eyes, and the eyes are buds. It's a modified stem. And so you're basically cloning Irish potato. So the whole country of Ireland was propagated by people were living off of Irish potatoes that were genetically alike. Okay, they put all their genetic eggs in one basket, so to speak. So they were all equally susceptible to the same fungus, pathogen or parasite. And people were eating 8 pounds of potatoes a day. That was their staple. That kind of carbohydrate is not healthy on the long term, but it kept them alive. And ultimately, because of that, so many people starved, millions of people starved. A lot of them migrated to the United States. And that fungus that affected this potato weakened a lot of. John F. Kennedy probably wouldn't have been president if that happened. So that fungus and what it did to the potato crop of Ireland had a big effect on the history of the world, the United States in particular. What's that got to do with anything? Well, it was when you do something asexually, you get a lot of individuals really quick. And that's a short-term advantage. But the disadvantage, you don't get genetic variability. And so that's why we need to have sexual reproduction. Now, this is another example of asexual reproduction. This is the quaking aspen. And here, this whole bunch of trees out here are really products of one individual, an identical clone of trees. This is unusual because you got what's going on here is that the roots are doing the reproducing, and that's unusual. Now, redwoods or gymnosperm, they're another example. You can have a 1,500-year-old root sprout on a sequoia. Same thing, but normally when you propagate plants asexually, you do it through the stems, not the roots. Now, there are other examples that we'll talk about briefly this morning. When we're talking about sexual reproduction, we'll refer to asexual reproduction by spores. And bryophytes have another example. The textbooks will say Gemmy, if they say anything at all, Gemmae, which are little structures that are multicellular that are responsible for the asexual reproduction, grow a whole new plant. And the other thing that textbooks don't talk about in bryophytes is there's similar structures. Well, they're not similar. They're called brood bodies. A brood body is a miniature plant. Bryophytes, some of them, now a lot of bryophytes don't do any of that kind of asexual reproduction. They just fragment. And that fragmentation itself is an example. Just like this strawberry plant here, if you fragment it here, you got separate plants. And the same thing goes on in a lot of mosses, but some mosses have Gemmy, which are structures. If you Google Gemma GEMMA-A or GEMMA-E, or I'm not sure if they're going to be in that Botany for Dummies or not, but brood bodies, I doubt will be there. They're like miniature plants. They grow into new plants. So asexual reproduction can be as simple as fragmentation. It can be as complicated as spore production or gemmy production or brood body production. Now, the sexual reproduction. All right, this is our goal here, is to deal with this. And Jackie, I pretty know for sure that in your course that you're having, none of this is talked about in detail because it's just, for whatever reason, maybe it's not considered important. But anyway, we're going to deal with it because it helps to understand the biology of plants. And seed plants have, like ferns and fern allies, this kind of alternation of generations life cycle. Now, don't be surprised that during the course of this discussion, I'll turn the diagram sideways so that this line that's in the middle will be horizontal. But right here, what we're everything revolves around when fertilization takes place and when meiosis takes place. That determines those little circles that you drew, had you draw a moment ago. I hope you drew them. Again, what's the 50-cent word for fertilization? S-Y-N-G-A-M-E, and we're going to talk about that more in detail in a moment. But before we go into this, I'm going to, well, actually now everything above here is haploid. Okay, and on the matching, haploid is the number of kinds of chromosomes that there are. Diploid is twice that many. It's a total number of chromosomes. The N number, that's haploid, for humans is what? 23. Humans have 23 kinds or pairs, P-A-I-R-S, of chromosomes. But they have twice that number, 46 actual chromosomes, 23 from the mother, 23 from the father, maternal and paternal chromosomes. Now, before we go into this alternation of generations life cycle, we're going to start with a human life cycle first. In fact, every sexually reproducing organism on the face of the earth can be categorized into one of these three types of life cycles. It can be like yours, where the diploid is dominant. It's also known as gametic meiosis. It can be haploid dominant, primarily haploid, and that means zygotic meiosis, or the one that we're aiming to talk about today, in the most detail, is alternation of diploid and haploid generations. And it's called sporic meiosis because it is the spores that undergo meiosis, actually the spore mother cells that undergo meiosis to form the cells. Now, I'm going to trim this up a little bit. I don't think that word is on your slide. It's over here on your slide, but I had to add it to this slide, and you may have to add it to your slide if you can see it at 2 slides per page. Now, if you don't know the first cycle up here, you don't know much about yourself. The second, I doubt you know much about at all, B, because it's a kind of cycle that's typical of some algae, the primitive algae, and some fungi. Now, I had you to draw those 3 little circles, and the one that's got the tiny little wedge that's that's haploid, is this one, the animal cycle, your cycle. The one that's got the opposite, the tiny little wedge that's the diploid, is the zygote right here. So there's a zygote in both of these. There's actually a zygote down here. But these are diametrically opposite. The life cycle is like you're primarily diploid, and the cat is too. And over here, the life cycle is primarily haploid. And this haploid adult would be labeled the gametophyte. There is no multicellular diploid component over here in the algae and fungi. That's not true down here. See, the diploid individual comes from mitosis of the zygote. This zygote underwent what? meiosis. Your zygote underwent mitosis. All right, now let's go back. Dealing with you. Asexual, actually, a human female is born, they say, with all of the eggs that she'll ever ovulate, about 400, and they're in the ovaries, and every month, I guess it supposedly alternates one ovary to the other, but it's true, like in the cat, you get the oogonial cells in the ovaries that undergo meiosis to perform gametes, and one of them is an egg. And that's not important for our discussion much, but the truth is, in the human female and in some other animals, 3 of the products of meiosis die in the female and 1 survives, and that's the megagamete of the egg. And the male product of meiosis in the testes is the spermatozoid or sperm. It has a single flagellum. They unite, running bear meets little white dove, and we have not S-I-N gamete, but S-Y-N gamete, sex, gametic union. And then and here's a critical point right here. That is the first cell of the diploid generation. Over here is the first cell of the diploid generation. Here is the first cell of diploid generation, okay? Now, what happens at this point determines, now, all right, there's all these life cycles. I've already told you, everything revolves around when syngamy and meiosis take place with respect to one another, kind of chronologically according to clockwise on those circles. Now, to get this life cycle business straight, you need to focus. You need to get the processes, syngamy, meiosis, and a process that will, I don't see the word written here yet, but we'll talk about it, called differentiation. That's another process, not as familiar to you maybe, but you got to keep the processes separate from what's going into the process and what's coming out. Okay, and the S and N S and M that I told you are the processes. Now, when at fertilization, the zygote forms, and what's in between this zygote and you? An embryo. Okay, an embryo. And there's an embryo here too, but there's no embryo here because the zygote doesn't germinate by what? Mitosis. It germinates by what? Meiosis. And everything reverts back to the haploid condition. Now, this entity here this haploid cell is not a gamete, it's a spore. And a spore is an alien concept to most of you. And Donna and I were having a discussion, and she asked me if there were any diploid spores, and I said I don't know of any. And I looked it up in the Dictionary of Plant Botany, and it said a spore is a haploid entity, a cell. And my definition of a spore is a cell that grows into an adult. That's the gametophyte here, without fusion with another cell. The haploid adult is the gametophyte. Now, all right, let's go back over here and we got sperm and eggs. What are the 2 possible things that that could happen to a sperm and an egg? They do one of 2 things. They either unite to form a zygote, or they do what? They die. They die. It's a good thing some of them die. We'd be overpopulated more than we are. But anyhow, what would happen? Think about what would happen if the eggs in a female and the sperm in a male started dividing mitotically like they do here. Now, you wouldn't have a gamete, but you'd have a what? A spore. Okay, and so this haploid cells can undergo mitosis, and diploid cells can too. So this is a haploid entity. It's called the gametophyte, even though it's not is haploid adult. They tried to be simple here. You could write the word gametophyte on your slide. And at maturity, the gametophyte keeps doing mitosis, and eventually the word that's not here is differentiation. Differentiation, because at this point, I've already validated the rule of slides. I've been on this slide for 5 minutes, but it's such a pivotal slide. Now, at this point, some of these cells differentiate, change, metamorphosize. You can think of it, let's see if I can think of it's a sort of a developmental metamorphosis goes on here to produce these gametes. All right, now we're going to spend much of our time talking about this because this is what plants, higher plants do, including the fern allies do. Let's see if there's anything else I need to say. In reproductive cells, I already told you that's the gonads. Let's see what else. All right. I already said that fertilization is not the proper term for lower algae and fungi, because that's why syngametes should be here. But they tried to make it simple. I think let's see. Let me make sure I cover everything. All right. All right, now this is a fern life cycle. And this corresponds, actually, if you go back to this, I told you that this line would be turned horizontally, and that's what's going on here. It is, this line is horizontal. Now, most of you, everybody here has seen the ferns. Most of you, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand because I can't see you the way I've got the view anyway. How many of you have ever seen a fern gametophyte? But this would be like the size of your little fingernail. And you have on the actually it's not too. Let's talk about this structure that's contained in the egg. It's on the matching. It's an archegonium, and the structure containing the sperm is the antheridium. Let me back out. Let me find this. Darn. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to. Oops, not that. I don't want to go into that. Archegonium. All right, this goes back to a slide from a long time ago when we were talking about what makes an embryophyte. All right, and what I've got here is an antheridium, which is a sex organ that contains sperm cells. And over here is a vase-like structure that's called an arch, archegonium, plural is this, that contains the egg. And these cells dissolve and the sperm swim down this neck and fertilize the egg. It's a little bit like amphibians in that external water is required to do that. But amphibians don't have, they do it in the open. There's no protection for that egg. Now, what is this? This is an algal sex cell. Actually, they unfortunately call this structure an antheridium, but it doesn't have a jacket. What you see here, this jacket, and this goes to what makes an embryophyte, what makes a land plant. You've got protection for the sex cells. Here you've got protection for the sex cells. And there's another antheridium in here, just a different, this is a moss one, this is a fern one, but the concept's the same. There's protection for the male sex cells here, protection for the moss egg here, the fern egg here, there's protection for them, okay? Now let's, I think we were on slide 346 or somewhere like that. Something like that. No, not that far. Further than I thought. Sorry about that. I overshot. I should have paid more attention. All right. All right, we're on this. Now, with that review of what that is and that is in a fern, and this is why they can live on land, you have a drop of water will make this sperm go over and swim down the neck of this archegonium and fertilize the egg, and that's what's going on right here. At that point, you've got the zygote right here. The zygote forms an embryo, which is not labeled and the embryo is not labeled here either, but the this little heart shape, and they're not all heart shaped, but the stereotype is heart shaped. Take a swig of coffee here. Okay, we've gone an hour already, so let's see, we're not going to finish. But anyhow, the heart-shaped prothallus or gametophyte is dying because the sporophyte is becoming independent, getting roots and leaves and a horizontal stem called a rhizome. Most ferns have horizontal stems called rhizomes, and a few of them have an erect rhizome, but that's the exception. The sporophyte, which is your counterpart, this is mitosis. Everything in here is mitosis and differentiation. Mitosis and differentiation. At this point, the spore case is on the little ZITS, what people call them, the zits on the underside. That's a loose term for a spore cluster is called a sorus, S-O-R-U-S in fern speak. And you can actually see this with a hand lens. And this is like a catapult. I've actually seen these suckers rear back and just catapult those spores. In fact, you think you got dust everywhere, and it's just spores. People that have ferns in their house, they're producing spores, and they got spores flying all around. It's kind of funny. They think it's dust, and it's just spores. And the spore comes out, germinates into something that's called a prothallus, Prothallus, which is a young gametophyte. And the gametophyte grows up into something that doesn't look anything like that. And when we continue on next week, we'll talk about isomorphic and heteromorphic alternation generations. Isomorphic means a sporophyte looks like gametophyte. Folks, that just doesn't look the case. This is a fern frond. This is 2 or 3 feet tall. This is practically microscopic. So it's heteromorphic, alternation of generations. And that was terms involved in the matching. And that cycle, instead of being perfectly across like you see in the middle here, who dominates? The sporophyte dominates. And here, the gametophyte is subordinate to it. The gametophyte is short-lived, independent for a short time, and then gets the sporophyte going, and the gametophyte dies and goes away. All right. So, and in bryophytes, of which you don't have this slide, I did send it to you in an email recently, in the last 2 or 3 days. Because in it, the life cycle is the opposite. You see, the sporophyte dominates here, and the gametophyte dominates. Okay, this haploid entity called the gametophyte dominates, and the sporophyte is got the smaller piece of the pie. It is parasitic or feeds on this gametophyte, and you got a foot embedded in the gametophyte, you got a seta, which is a stalk, and you got a spore capsule that produces spores, and that's where meiosis takes place. And it's hard to believe that this is the counterpart to a true leaf. I've got slides from my thesis, doctoral thesis, that shows stomates up in the wall of this capsule like it was a leaf. It's phenomenal to see that. But this you don't have as a slide. You can print it out, that email with this attachment, and put it in with the slides if you want to. Why am I showing it? Because I didn't have a moss life cycle because I wanted to compare a heteromorphic cycle, primarily gametophyte, with one that was primarily sporophyte, heteromorphic. They're both heteromorphic. The sporophyte doesn't look like the gametophyte in the fern, and the sporophyte doesn't look like the gametophyte in the moss. Now, what's the significance of all this? The significance is this, my friends, this kind of cycle is why mosses are not considered ancestors of higher plants, because the gametophyte is the most prevalent. Now, I think I'm gonna have to back off of this to show you. You know what? Let's pull the plug on this. Before I do, let me stop the screen sharing and show you this. Can everybody see that? Turn on the audios a minute.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Turn on the audios. All right.
Yes.
Number one. Actually, let's go with number 3 first. Number 3 is a fern frond, sporophyte. Number 1 is a lycopodium stem, a club moss. Okay. Number 2 is a true moss. It's a polytrichum, a haircap moss, and unfortunately, when it's dry, it looks pretty pathetic. But when it's wet, it looks as bushy as the club moss. All right. Number 1 and number 3 are diploid. Number 2 is a gametophyte. It's haploid. So the point is, anything with that doesn't mean that higher plants exactly evolved straight from ferns and fern allies, but it means that any higher plant to evolve from a lower plant would have to be following a route where the sporophyte was dominant, not the gametophyte. Okay, so when you walk through the woods and see a true moss, you're looking at the gametophyte. When you see in the woods a club moss, like a podium or a fern, you're looking at the sporophyte. We've gone a little over an hour and 5 minutes, and it's probably a good time to stop because we'll probably spend most of all on the 11th. Jackie, I don't know if you heard us talking. We're not going to do 4th of July, but we're going to do the following Sunday. I'm open to doing this on an evening sometime, but instead of a Sunday morning, but we'd have to find a common, and you'd have to talk among yourselves, and I could do any evening you wanted to. But anyway, are there any questions? It would be a good time to ask questions now before we break. I've covered a lot, and but it's probably a good breaking point, because when we go back, we'll focus on heteromorphic and actually could show you a few isomorphic alternation generations, which have to do with that slide set that I sent later called the addendum. All right. There are no questions? I hope I haven't confused you. I hope I've clarified something. All right.
Thanks, Bobby.
Thank you.
Okay.
We'll digest for a
You
week.
feel any better, Donna?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right. You know what?
But I tell you what, really you need that dictionary of botany to get those matching things to match.
Yeah, that's true. That's true too. But related to that, why don't you people go? I believe what I would do. I'm not going to make you do it. I think I'd go back and print out the original one that I sent you that didn't have the answers on it, and do it again.
Yeah.
And see if you could do. It. All right, you did. Not every. Donna's lucky she got that dictionary of botany for about $5. You can get it, but if you don't have it, that's okay. I would just having listened to me go through this, you could do a good bit of it. The one 13 and 14 I haven't talked about, that homosphorous and heterosphorous life cycle. That's fairly complicated. But most, and I haven't talked about ovules and micro. Actually, we did talk about micropyle. Back in when I was talking about a lima bean, if you pull the seed coat off of a lima bean and look at it carefully, you can see where the sperm entered the micropyle with your naked eye. That's unusual. But, all right, let's call it. I'm sorry I didn't get any further, but I think we've done enough. All right, probably a good intermission time. All right, y'all.